As a teacher, and as the professional, you are well placed, possibly best placed to know what to teach your children. Um, Firstly, the first thing you do is you get hold of the specification from the exam board, or internationally, sometimes I know some boards and some schools follow textbooks. So you get a hold of that, and that is your first task. This is an example of the physics specification from the UK. This will give you an overarching view of what you have to cover and possibly what's already come before it. It'll also really give you an idea of what the pupils need to know before you teach the content. This bit is absolutely crucial. As the professional, you know what is right to teach your pupils. Now, if that's not in the specification of the textbook, that's absolutely fine. But if it adds to their journey and it adds to the learning process, absolutely incorporate it. So now I'm looking at the objectives that have already been covered. And if you have an example here, looking at the specification and the objectives that I've added, at this point, you have to be a little bit more choosy with the objectives you need. So I would now narrow in and choose the ones specifically that adhere to the lesson you want to teach. Now here comes the absolute crux of it. So you actually start at the end. I would now advocate actually producing what you want the pupils to produce. I mean, all the pupils, I want you to actually produce it. And here's an example I've done for the DT graph. So the first part, I want a 3-part graph, and we're looking at labeling the axes with the units, but I can't achieve all my objectives with this graph, so I'm going to have to now draw a different graph, and that's here. To do the objectives, I need to be able to, and the pupils need to be able to calculate a gradient, so I do a quick rough calculation like I've done here. I actually go through the process of doing the unit analysis. And now, and only now, do we start thinking about the tasks involved. Here, the tasks are important, but please don't feel the tasks take over the learning. Really incorporate the school priorities and the priorities of the curricula that you serve. So if I was to incorporate active learning, this is where I think about my tasks. I will incorporate active learning into this. If I want to incorporate inquiry, this is now where so an example here is of modelling, of inquiry, of conclusion writing, of actually seeing your science, is this video here. I actually use it as a whole project, and we look at the distance time graphs, the velocity time graphs, the momentum, the kinetic energy of the whole thing, and then at the end of it we make a judgment together as a class. Is it real or is it fake? It's an old advert by Nike, and it's where a footballer, Cristiano Ronaldo, races a sports car, Bugatti Veyron. Earlier I mentioned prior learning, and with all prior learning you have to assess, because there's no point in steaming ahead with any sort of rhetoric or any sort of lesson without first knowing where the pupils are. And if the pupils aren't there, you have to stop and change your lesson and your planning. So I start every lesson with something I call a zip test. Now, it's just a low stakes accountability model where we just ask the pupils 10 quick questions just to assess where they are. So in this lesson, I'd want them to already know that distance equals speed times time. So the question would be, question 1, distance equals, finish the equation for me please. Question 2, what is the unit for distance? Question 3. And as I ask these questions and I see the pupils answer, and we go through the answers later, I'm making a judgment as I'm walking around on where the pupils are. How many of them are really confident on the questions I ask, and how many of them are not. modelling and conclusion writing in this lesson was also a priority at the time. I wanted my pupils to be able to draw conclusions from their science, but I also wanted them to present it in a much better way. So an example would be here, I would have asked, do you think this video is real or fake? The pupils would have come out with their answers, and then I would have put up a slide like this. Now, this slide is me, and you can see I have no hair at the moment. And we then evaluate the answers of which is the better conclusion. And then together as a class, obviously guided by the teacher, we form a success criteria of which is the best conclusion to write. And how do we get to the end? I will say this again, with your tasks and activities, it's great to have a multitude, a variety of different activities, but if the pupils do not understand, and I mean even if it's a handful of pupils do not understand, you have to act as a teacher, even if that means moving the pupil next to a pupil that you know is doing okay, even if that means that you walk around and support those pupils, you have to act. Because those pupils, if you don't, will be absolutely lost. And what normally happens in classrooms is if pupils get lost, what happens is the gap just gets bigger and bigger because they can't access the work as they go on. Now, the absolute crux of this is when you assess their work, because you're not assessing for everything in the whole specification, you're only assessing for those objectives that you chose. So in marking their books or feeding back, all you do is look out for those.